Hi, I'm David Kiehn with the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum, and I'm here with Gary Parks, following up on his previous presentation. Hello, Gary.
Hi, David.
Um, you're looks like you're comfortably sitting in your in a corner of your apartment there with a few extra
Yeah,
items around you.
yes, I guess you could say I collected some spare parts. I am sitting in a 1929 movie theater seat salvaged from the balcony of the Fox Theater in San Francisco. And in between the Fox's demolition in 1963 and my acquisition of it about 6 years ago, it went through several other owners. And but I did want to, before we move on, and hopefully we'll have some questions, I did want to just point out a few features here. First of all, the upholstery is not original. A previous owner put that on, which is wonderful. But we do have original finish on the aisle standard here. If you saw my presentation, when we looked at the Warner Theater in Torrington, Connecticut, I had a close-up of an Art Deco aisle standard on the end of a row of seats. And all people who love old theaters usually have a few things that they really geek out on. And this is one of mine. This and terrazzo sidewalks and light fixtures and the neon marquees. But yeah, this has original 1929 paint on it. It was originally gold with some crimson, mostly worn off. But I found out that it was in the balcony, and the way you can tell that is it was on a level surface. The legs are even. When they're built for a sloping floor, they're a little off kilter. But I also found when I cleaned out the lamp housing, because you can see I have it wired up here for an aisle light. It's on right now. That's what that little light you see is. And when I opened that up, there was a lot of dust in there, but there was also a plastic wrapper for a cigarette box. Smoking was allowed in the balcony at the Fox, so this had to have come from the balcony. But yes, these are orphaned aisle standards. They represent about a third of my collection of some of those. And really quick, we'll go chronologically.
Sure.
They're
Yeah.
all, yeah, they're all from, I'm sorry?
Go
Oh,
ahead.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are all from San Francisco. This one here is from, if any of you are acquainted with the Metro Theater on Union Street, it's now an indoor gym. Parts of it are restored. This was discovered in the theater in 1998 when United Artists gave it a seismic retrofit and made it ADA compliant by moving some floors around and things. 7 of these were found in a little loft up above one of the old pipe organ chambers backstage. And I was a consultant on the project. We made a wee bit of money, but then they also presented me with one of these. In the center is a little letter M with a little wreath around it. And American Seating made these, and you could order them with the initial of your theater in the center. So this is original paint on here. It was only in use from 1924 until 1941, and then the theater got all new seats and a redecoration job. And a few of them were stored backstage, and everybody had forgotten about them. We also found 3 original chandeliers, broken, but they were there. This one I discovered in the basement of the Coliseum Theater on Clement Street when it was after it had been closed by the Lower Prieta quake, and it was down there. It was very, very dirty. Had no armrest. The armrest is from another end standard, and I cleaned it off. And I know it's a little hard to see on camera. I realize that, but there's some dull gold and some crimson accents and a little bit of blue. And then moving, so that's 1920s also. And then moving to probably the 1950s. This is a veteran which I removed myself from the balcony of the Strand on Market Street. And the Strand had a very colorful history. For many years it was a grindhouse, then it was a much loved repertory cinema for many years, for a good decade and a half. Then after that, it went to adult programming and became quite a interesting habitat. But anyway, I've always said if this aisle standard could talk, the stories it could tell, or maybe it's good that it can't, I don't know. But an interesting detail here is there's a little evidence of fabric sticking out of this here. And so this particular one had padding on the armrest, which is kind of unusual. But it's got a circular housing for the lamp with a little spiral design on it, almost like a little snail shell. And so it's very plain, but indicative of its period. So that's part of my little collection there. So
Um, those remnants made me think about the survival rate of theaters. There's always been a lot of talk about how just a fraction of the silent films that were made survive.
mhm.
And I think that's pretty true for the theaters as well. So many were torn down, so many converted to other uses. Uh,
Right.
the number that survive seems to be very, very small. And if you look at what there was, for instance, in Oakland, it seems like there's practically nothing from the teens around that survived that I can recall. Uh,
Right.
it's a little better in San Francisco. Um, some of the seems like some of the early Nickelodeons are still around, like the Vogue Theater and
Right.
on Sacramento Street,
Mhm.
and
With the Roxy, which was originally a Nickelodeon.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and of course the Clay. And there are other Nickelodeons that have long since been turned into other things, um, but still look like Nickelodeons. My favorite is on Haight Street in the heart of the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. It stopped being a theater. I don't remember the exact year, but I want to say in the late 20s. And it had two names, but its most well-known name was the Superba. In fact, it became the Superba Market after that. But its facade is almost totally intact. I mean, it's got shop windows at the bottom, but it's got some lion heads on the front. I believe there's like a court jester in the center, and then you can see sockets where there were light bulbs all around the facade. Very well preserved. I mean, it still screams Nickelodeon, from far away. Yeah.
yeah, and I think it dates back to 1909, if I recall correctly.
I think it is about that old.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's also the Four Star on Clement Street.
Right.
This
Oh
is,
yeah, yeah,
um,
yep.
and I think all of those were probably built as movie theaters. I don't know if was the
Oh yeah, oh
Roxy
yeah. Yes,
purpose
yes,
built too.
yes. It was
Uh,
purpose built for movies. Yeah, yep.
yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
I actually have the blueprints, the original blueprints of the Roxy as originally built as a Nickelodeon, and I have the Superba as well. And it's fun because you go in the Superba, which has been a used clothing store since at least the '80s. That's when I first went in there, and all down the side walls are these pilasters, engaged columns with Ionic capitals on them. The proscenium arch is gone, but there are these columns going down the side and a light cove running down the side. And it's interesting on a lot because I have a number of Nickelodeon blueprints, and so many of them literally had a curtainless screen right up against the back wall with some sort of an ornamental border around it, like a picture frame. And then a few did have curtains, but most of them did have a tiny stage in front that just in case they were going to book a comedian in there or somebody to add a narration to the film other than the pianist or organist or whoever was in there. So yeah, it's fun to see how they were built. So many of them were so plain though, They were
yeah, and of
pretty plain.
course, in the earliest Nickelodeon days, they were converted storefronts. I think a lot of those that were on Fillmore Street after the fire of 1906 earthquake, Fillmore Street became Nickelodeon Row, and got turned into theaters very quickly after the fire, so that because nothing was left in
Right.
downtown San Francisco, and unfortunately, all of that got torn down in the 70s with redevelopment.
Oh, I know.
I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
I think the only theaters on Fillmore are what was originally the Progress Theater that's near Geary Street.
Mm,
It's still got its archway.
yeah.
I think it's a clothing store or something now. And
Right. Right.
and then not the Clay Theater, is that? Um, there's another one on Fillmore that's on the other side
Yeah.
that still survives, I think. But
Yeah. There were a few people that I knew that have since passed away that were San Franciscans who got out there. They were like in their 20s and 30s, and they got out there with their cameras and shot slides of some of those theaters when they were coming down. So like the new Fillmore Theater, not to be confused with the Fillmore Auditorium that, of 1960s fame that, a lot of us have been to, but actual movie theaters that were along there. And they took some pictures when those were being torn down. So we do have colored picture documentation of some of these coming down. There was actually an old, and you may know this, but there was actually one that was called the Orpheum, nice vaudeville theater, purpose built, and then one built right next door to it called the Princess, and the two of them stood side by side, and each of them did a turn as a church before it was torn down, and served the neighborhood very, very well, and survived for a long time because of the church use, and a lot of theaters still in the Bay Area are out there in the neighborhood serving as churches. East Oakland has a bunch. I've been in a few of them, and you go in, and some of them very much look like neighborhood movie palaces or former little tiny theaters, maybe Nickelodeons, and then others get completely redone. There was a trend, I'd say, starting maybe in the 50s, going into the 70s of, I guess, ritualistically purifying the building by painting over everything in white. And and some of them are still like that, but there's somewhere where they've respected some of the original paint that they came across, like the Fairfax in East Oakland, which was an atmospheric style theater with a partial imitation sky on the ceiling and then kind of a tent ceiling, just done in paint, not sculpted like what you see at the Castro. But it's still beautifully maintained, and all the ornament is still there, all the plaster work is there. They still have the original curtain, which they keep in kind of a half up position to expose the choir area for their choir and their praise band and so forth. And years ago, the pastor there was really welcoming to. I was working at the time on helping as a volunteer put in a pipe organ back into the Golden State Theater in Monterey, which has an identical auditorium almost to the Fairfax. And we found out about the Fairfax. So I wonder if there'd be a way to get in. And through an intermediary, we got an appointment with the pastor, and he let us in. Took pictures. And yeah, it's virtually an identical auditorium. A couple of decorative details are different, but it's the same. Way different exterior, way different lobby. But it was just amazing to see how here was the curtain. There was some original carpeting in some of the lounges and everything. And he said that when they first got that theater, bought it from United Artists, the whole auditorium was painted beige and gray. He said, well, the theater that we're working on in Monterey was also painted beige and gray. And we got involved in later repainting that. And I did some of that professionally and some of it as a volunteer. And now the one in Monterey is beautifully painted. But I understand the Fairfax still, they did some nice sprucing up. And it looks pretty good. So
the Lauren Theater in Berkeley is an interesting one that's now a church.
have you been in that one? Because
I have been in it. Yeah, I went in one day and was shown around. It's the main floor is totally changed. They took out all the seats and put in pews for the congregation. But if you go up into the balcony, the original theater seats are still up there on the flats, just like the seat you're sitting in.
Right.
They've got steps up, and so the seats aren't angled like they were in the auditorium. You can also look in the projection booth, the 10-line projection booth. There's nothing in there, unfortunately, but except the lining, but it is still there to see. At least the last time I looked, it was.
Yeah. I still have not been in there, and I understand though decoratively. I mean, the outside looks like a theater built in the teens, which it was. Got some arches and pilasters and moldings and things. But I understand that the interior, I believe I've seen one of the archival photos, maybe in the Jack Tilmany collection or one of those, that has the interior was redone in quite elaborate Art Deco. I guess it's painted all one neutral color now, but at one time it was quite over the top. Early 30s. Kind of a little suburban Paramount miniature in a way. I don't mean literally, but I mean that style of Art Deco. Can you speak to that? Do you remember if there was anything along that line?
Not that I recall. It's been a few
Right.
years since I looked in there.
Yeah, of course, like I say, I'm an ornamental plaster geek. So sometimes it's like my oldest cousin, also named Gary. He started out his professional life as a teenager as a projectionist for United Artists, working in the Sierra Theater in Susanville, beautiful Art Deco theater, way remote up in the Sierras. And he didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to the decor, but he can tell you exactly what the projection booth was like. And I took him to the Los Angeles Theater in Los Angeles, which is very ornate, French, Baroque, and everything. And we went to see a classic movie there, he and his wife and their daughter and so on. And beautifully well-preserved theater, unrestored though. And so I took them around and showed them everything, architecturally. We got, after the movie, we went into the booth, which is amazing, just an amazing booth, black and white checkered floor, or maybe it's green and white. Anyway, it's checkered. All this old equipment, your rectifier, everything. It was close to an hour before he and the projectionist were done talking, and even went on a little long even for me, but just a wonderful booth and just terrific equipment in there and everything. So yeah, just really,
So
really.
are there other San Francisco theaters that have been closed for a while that you've been able to get into?
Well, in the past, yes. I mean, I've been into several. A friend of mine who does architectural salvage, for instance, the Coliseum on Clement. Well, I got this actually with United Artists' blessing when they still owned the property. And I was in there with a guy who was there he'd been ordered by the company to take out all the sinks out of the men's and ladies' rooms because they knew they weren't going to reopen the theater. It was just too costly to do seismic retrofit, and they were looking to sell it. But then I was in there again when they were starting to demolish and gut it out for condos and a Walgreens. And my friend got more things out of there, etched glass windows that had been added in the 30s that have been plastered over, and some other things, and a couple of chandeliers. They're supposed to get more, but that's a long story. But yeah, they were the wrecking claw was going in there and just pulling things out. And I was so glad that theater, when I got this out, I did a full photo documentation of the interior. And if you go on San Francisco's theaters.blogspot.com, which aims to be a comprehensive documentation of San Francisco theaters. Bill Counter, the historian, has done that for both San Francisco and LA. And my photos that I took in 1995 of the interior, it was kind of dimly lit. I did all these time exposures, but they show the theater how it was in its last days. Some of its Art Deco still there, and then kind of its 60s decor. It got painted olive green with rust red carpet and so forth. But yeah, there are still things lurking around. There are a few that I haven't been in. Again, East Oakland, another theater, the Palace, which was built in the teens and then remodeled in 1930 by the same architects who designed it initially, Reed Brothers. And you can see it when you go through East Oakland on the BART tracks. You're going along on BART, you're kind of elevated a bit, and if you know where to look, you can see this big kind of white building with the stage fly tower. You're basically looking at the side of it. And certainly, of course, it's a theater. And its interior is, if any of you are familiar with the Fox Arlington Theater in Santa Barbara or the Merced Theater in Merced, has a similar auditorium, kind of a Mexican village with whitewashed walls and tile roofs. And it had an artificial night sky on the ceiling. And the church that had that for many years, they took it over in the 50s. And they painted the interior almost all white, except for some reason, the proscenium arch and the ceiling just over it still have stenciling made to look like wooden beams, and that's still there. Little sad story with that one. The church sold it, or else leased it out to a performing arts group, and they were putting on shows in there and looking to restore it. And that went down the tubes because the people that were running those shows were the people involved in the ghost ship artist collective that burned. And not far away. I mean, those two buildings are within shouting distance practically. And so unfortunately that deal did not go through to have it be a live theater for the community, and indeed for all of Oakland, really. For more experimental type theater and stuff where people could try things out and really be kind of edgy and try new things. But the happy part of it is, though, a new church has gone in there and they respect the building, and so at least it'll be standing and it'll be in use. It won't be sitting there abandoned. So that's good. But yeah, trying to think of other things that are, little undiscovered gems.
Have you been in the Alexandria on Gary Street?
I have, and when I acquired a big set of many blueprints of San Francisco that have been saved, when they were passed on to me, which I'm very grateful for, by another historian, Gary Goss. I looked in there, and that was one of the first things I was looking. And when I got the box, I said, "Is the Alexandria in here?" And he got this big smile. He said, "No." And when I got this set of blueprints in 1975, it wasn't there either. The El Dorado, the big kahuna, the big mystery is, will anyone ever find photos of the original decorative scheme of the Alexandria? We've got plenty of photos of how it looked at the beginning of the 40s when it was remodeled inside. But we know from descriptions it was ancient Egyptian style, and my other passion is ancient Egypt. And of course, Egyptian theaters are lots of fun. And I do actually have some fragments of the original lobby decor, which are little scenes of Egyptian figures on the walls. Long story how I got those, but it was a very lucky thing. And so we have some fragments, but we know a few of the features from descriptions of the auditorium. There were heads of pharaohs on the walls and big urns that were floodlit and so on. And we know that the dome in the ceiling is original. When I went in there, I got to go up into the attic, and it was very interesting because, it was with the same person that I'd gotten into the Coliseum. It was a red letter day. Got to go in the Coliseum and take lots of pictures, and then take a few souvenirs. And then we went over to the Alexandria, which was still very much running at the time. They were running the second Babe the Pig movie. I remember that. And got to go up into the attic. And what was fun there was I could see the dome and see the crank used for cranking down the central chandelier. And then we went toward the proscenium, and I looked down through a little space, and I could see the movie running on the screen way down below. Walking on these redwood catwalks, and if you looked at the walls up in the attic, you could see where at one point the cast concrete pipe organ chambers on either side of the stage and screen had been jackhammered out, and then the new walls furred in that would just curve in toward the screen in a more streamlined style. And then later, murals were painted on those, which are still there, sea nymphs and waves and clouds, very 1940s. And so, up there, and then up near the projection booth, there was a little fragment of plaster cornice, what they call a cavetto molding, which was very much the cornice that Egyptians used to put on top of their walls, and so on. So, here was a little fragment of the auditorium original decor up by the booth. But yeah, that's the Alexandria, and I hope I live to see when they're planned to do something with the interior of that. And I understand, from the drawings and renderings, it will respect a lot of the architecture, but it will be repurposed into something non-theatrical, though.
All the seats are gone, or
Actually, I don't know. I don't know if when Regal, which bought out United Artists, I'm sure they took the projection equipment. They always do that. Occasionally, they do take the seats and sell them if they're more modern and can be used someplace else. If they're real old vintage ones, they usually leave them. With the Coliseum, its whole balcony was full of two different styles of seats. They had their original leather in the upper part, and then down below they had the wonderful cranberry mohair, and all those were just taken out with a wrecking club. It just pulled them down out of the balcony, and they were a twisted pile on the ground. But yeah, it's you win a few, you lose a few when you go in to do salvage. So yeah.
So much is gone from Market Street now that was there before.
Yeah.
It's
the Fox.
It's just a remnant now.
Yeah.
The Imperial got torn down just a few years ago.
I was part. Well, you know this, but other people may not. I was part of the salvage team on that. As far as hands-on salvage, I didn't do a whole lot, but the main thing that was salvaged was the original window on the facade, which said Grauman's Imperial Theater. Now, folks, if you know contemporary San Francisco, that theater ended its life at Market Street Cinema. Strippers, lap dancers, private booths, all that good stuff. Remodeled so many times it was almost unrecognizable. But behind all those walls, there was stuff from its 1930 Art Deco conversion to be the United Artists Theater for San Francisco. Above and behind that, there was stuff original from 1912, what we call Vienna secessionist style, which involved elements of arts and crafts and Art Nouveau as well as a little neoclassicism and a tiny bit of Egyptian. And it was a wild and weird theater. Just Sid Grauman always went toward the exotic and that was the first theater that he had built from scratch. Before that, he leased other properties. And so yeah, I was able to retain, and I have a few fragments of plaster from the lobby. The whole upper half of the lobby was there above a drop ceiling, intact, with bare light bulb sockets set into little bronze lotus-shaped flowers. And then, of course, this stained glass window, which had been covered over completely, first with paint in the 20s, and then with plaster in 1930 when it got its Art Deco redo. But we knew that it was behind there, and we convinced the developer who built a 9-story high-rise condominium tower on the site to pay for that window's restoration, its removal and restoration, and it is on permanent display in the lobby of the condo tower. You can walk down the street along Market. You can't go right up to it because only people who live there can go in, and they're invited guests. But you can peek through the clear glass doors. It's not directly facing the street, but if you're walking away from the bay, it'll be very obvious because it's lit behind with LEDs, in just a big wash of light. And Grauman's Imperial Theater with 3 jeweled crowns, an amber glass background, beautiful opalescent glass. And my most important involvement with that was finding the right guy to restore that. Ken Manazian of Oceana Stained Glass. I had worked with him professionally on some projects where I used to work in stained glass design and still work in etched glass. But our shop most of the time didn't handle restoration, and I forget what it was. It wasn't a church, but anyway, we found Ken, and I basically brought the job to him. So that was just great, and it was a real challenging thing. It was one of the largest things he'd ever done. That window was 22 feet wide by 9.5 feet high at its center. It was a gentle arch, but it's there. It's restored. But while we were at it, we salvaged some other things. The owner of the property wanted to keep a few things. But we were able to have some things too. So my garden hose rack is a fire hose rack from the Imperial, bronze plated cast iron with kind of a fleur-de-lis and shield in it, and various other things, and plaster as well, and a few other odds and ends that we found. We're not sure if we came in contact with the notorious ghosts that were supposed to be in there. There was all kinds of talk on the internet, ghost hunters going in there after it was closed, all sorts of stories. Yeah. We did have a few little weird, unexplainable things happen, but who knows? So, no Ghostbusters and no Sixth Sense, really.
A sad teardown that I witnessed was the Berkeley Theater on Shattuck Avenue.
Oh, yeah.
1911. That was, the people that approved it, I didn't realize what was there when, it had been heavily remodeled on the front to make it look modern, I guess in the 40s or so.
Well, yeah, I can speak to that a tiny bit, and then I want to hear what your part here. But the facade was completely covered over and redone in the late 30s by Los Angeles architect S. Charles Lee, and he had started designing in the 20s, big movie palaces and everything, and then got into very much what was at the time the modern style. And yeah, it actually was a very attractive front, but the as I love to say, the illuminated sign haters ordered that theater to remove its beautiful neon vertical sign and get rid of most of the neon off the front and the beautiful neon clock that was in the center, and it all got painted out 1970s organic colors, brown and tan. We have to make it of the earth, man, far out. Mm-hmm. And instead of streamlined modern, Deco hadn't come in yet in its rebirth in the 80s. And yeah, and so that was it was a nice front before it got kind of sliced up, like you say. But yeah, as you know, behind it was the original. Anyway, you got to see it more than I did. By the time I got to the site, all that was left was the terrazzo sidewalk.
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I would walk by it during the process of it being torn down,
yeah.
and after they removed the marquee and all of the modern stuff that had been put up in front, you could see the original arch with the bulb sockets still in the arch, uh, different color brick that alternated around
Which
the arch.
matched the hotel next door, which is still there. They
Yeah,
missed an opportunity. The developers of that whole part, could have kept that facade. Those stripes would have continued right in line because I saw old photos. Yeah,
just incredible. There was
I
a
know, I
three
know.
sheet poster of a Florence Turner movie that had been glued onto the cement wall,
I heard
and
the posters
and
on the top of the wall. Yeah,
during that time period, yeah, it was I think it was a drizzly period where there was intermittent rain, and as I walked by day after day, I would see the posters slowly peeling off the wall and and splitting into pieces. Uh,
that wasn't. I remember looking up there and seeing little bits of what appeared like paper, and I wonder if they were posters. There was bits of color, and I remember what was still there at the time, since it shared a common wall with the hotel. There were bits of the Art Deco S. Charles Lee modern remake. The plaster on the walls. There were these fluted pillars going down the side, although they've been painted out like, was it lavender and turquoise or something, maybe in the 50s or 60s. I mean, and then I think it was white in between or something. But yeah,
mhm, mhm.
yeah. Oh boy.
Now, I lived in Berkeley for 25 years, and so I actually went to that theater when it was open quite a bit,
I
seeing.
never did. Was it draped on the inside, just curtains on the walls, or?
Yeah, it was pretty plain looking with a very small balcony,
Mhm.
and the theater that I spent the most time at was the UC Theater on University Avenue, built in 1917.
It's beautiful. I only went to a movie there once. It was when I was going to California College of the Arts, and I took a history of Japanese cinema class, and we'd watch. It was once a week class that went on for 4 hours every week, and we'd get a lecture, and then we'd watch one or two movies, and so I got to learn who Ozu and Mitsugushi and Kurosawa were, and everything, and saw some interesting films, but during the time I was taking that class, here was the repertory schedule, and there were two stories by Ozu, I think it was. Anyway, both of them were quite violent, though. I went home kind of going, "Ugh," But anyway, it was about some young people and stuff and their drugs, and it was very modern. It was not a samurai epic, we'll put it that way. But I went in there, and the theater was beautiful. The organ chambers are still there with the grills, original proscenium with a little Julius Caesar kind of bust it looks like an ancient coin in the center, and there were these Art Deco tulip-like fixtures on the walls. Yeah, beautiful house, just beautiful. And but yeah, it's the one time I ever went there. We need to go to a concert there or something. I need to see something there and see how it does. I hear it does well as live.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I haven't been in it since it was remodeled and I guess turned into some other kind of venue.
Yeah, live concerts. Yeah. Apparently, they are equipped for movies, digital in some form. So I know Gary Meyer was involved, in seeing to it that the place, because I mean that was when he started Landmark Theaters. That was his first, and I'm sure I believe he was involved in engineering that a respectful restoration or remodeling happened. 'Cause-
Yeah, they repaired all of the seats in the theater. It was a
wow.
pretty large auditorium, and so that was
Yeah,
a lot of seats that they had to go through and fix up. And
absolutely. Yeah. All on one floor in there. I mean, it
yeah,
gentle slope. I remember this big sloping floor.
yeah,
Yep.
good place to see films. It was
Yeah.
really. I saw dozens and dozens of films there.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Um,
Well, here's the thing that brings up something. My first half of childhood, as I mentioned in my presentation, so I won't repeat myself too much. From the time I was essentially born to 10, I lived in Seal Beach, and so theaters in Seal Beach and Long Beach and stuff were the places I went. And then from 10 to 21, lived in Aptos, so Santa Cruz County. So I went to a few theaters in that. We had a few historic theaters in that county, Del Mar and Rio and Santa Cruz, and then later the first theater I ever volunteered to work on was the Fox in Watsonville, a beautiful 1923 theater that got a few remodels in the 30s and 40s, and it's sitting there dormant, by the way. But they're in initial talks again about bringing that back for this time for performing arts and stuff. So we'll see. It has a beautiful stage, very circular. But in those days, for going to movies as I was a kid, our repertory cinema in Santa Cruz was the Sash Mill Cinema, and it was literally a window sash mill, corrugated roof, substantial building, nice steel girders on the ceiling and everything. It was a 200-seat theater. I counted once when I got there early, and stadium style in back, and then you could go down front, and if people needed wheelchairs, they'd bring them around the side entrance and they could go in. They had a little area. No curtain, nice adjustable screen. But all the years I went there, I would ask people if I saw somebody new selling tickets or behind the counter. I said, "Where are the seats from?" Because there were two styles of seats. One in the back was Art Deco, and the other was this pattern right here, actually, but without the F. So I knew it was not from the San Francisco Fox. And so there were these seats, and then 4 wall sconces on the walls, which were cast iron, wrought iron, with stained glass. And where did this stuff come from? Nobody knew. And I still to this day don't know where the seats came from. But I did finally find out that the 4 wall sconces were out of the Fox Oakland. Somebody had redone the shades in stained glass, the 1970s when the theater opened. That was the golden age of the revival of stained glass. And Santa Cruz had a zillion people making stained glass at the time. So somebody made some nice shades. But yeah, I know somebody else who has several wall sconces from the Fox Oakland. He lives out in the Delta. And I saw those. I'm going, Sash Mill. And he says, "No, Fox Oakland." they had their original shades on there. So as you can see, it's really easy to geek out on light fixtures, seats, plaster, all that good stuff. You probably look at. Of course, I know you look at cameras and projectors and everything. I love that too. I'm just not an authority on it. So I let people like yourself, we got to spread this stuff around, our specialty.
Were you ever in the Royal Theater in San Francisco on Polk Street?
Yeah, I was. In fact, my friend who does salvage, he actually did salvage on that. Got some things out of there. He still has the manager's phone. Yeah, and that was designed by Reed Brothers, who became the most prolific movie theater architects in the Bay Area. They did the Grand Lake. That was their largest theater. But yeah, that was an interesting theater. In the 90s.
Lobby, you go in on
Polk Street. Yeah. I saw Ed Wood there and some other stuff.
And you make a left turn to go into the auditorium, which was
exactly.
It was never divided, so all the seats were there. And,
exactly. I mean, that was one of Blumenfeld Theater's flagships for a long time. In the 70s or early 80s, it went porn for a while, and then I remember I was living in Aptos, and I knew it had been porn because I'd seen a recent picture of it in a book on San Francisco architecture. I thought, well, I wasn't worried about going into porn theaters because of what was on the screen. It was like I was young and I just didn't want to deal with the other patrons, and we'll leave it at that. but I was just a small town kid, right? And anyway, so but I wanted to go into the Royal, and then on, I don't know, it was KSJO or KOME or something like that, I heard that they were having the Bay Area premiere of the Rolling Stones movie, Let's Spend the Night Together. And I thought, that theater's gone first run, and it had. And so it took me till the 90s to go there for Ed Wood and a few other movies there. So I'm very glad I went in there. But it was an example of a theater that had been remodeled a number of times and originally had a brick facade that matched the apartment building that's still next door with an arch and a canopy marquee with stained glass and so on. And then later, Timothy Pfluger, who helped design the Bay Bridge and did the Oakland Paramount and the Castro and the Alhambra and San Francisco and several others, he did a beautiful 1930 sheet metal facade, which is still there today, partly replica, partly original parts, from what I understand. And others might be out there going, no, it was all a replica. I'm not sure, but I know they saved some parts of it when they were dismantling it. So they took this beautiful Art Deco front down, and then the whole thing got demolished. And but yeah, like I say, my friend did architectural salvage on it, and I know a few other parties got in there and saved some things as well. Um, and yeah, there was still, what I call high Art Deco in evidence in the lobby. But once you got into the auditorium, it was just kind of plain. It had been painted out, but there was still around the top of the wall, worthy of a Roman temple. There was original cornice work up there. The moldings were definitely, it's like, that's original, So,
When Nickelodeon started getting ornate with Decorative Supply Company materials and things like that, it seems kind of like that kind of ushered in what would become the beginning of the movie palaces. Do you think that had a big influence on the
yeah.
style that came after?
And Decorators Supply is still in business, and they got on the bandwagon and worked on the big movie palaces too. Some people have thought that they did, all of them, and they didn't. There were many plaster companies, and different companies would use their own people that they knew. And there were people that there were some things. It wasn't all catalog order, although there was plenty of that. There was a lot of that. But for the major palaces, they would actually sculpt in clay custom stuff, like the San Francisco Fox. Some of the light fixtures were cataloged, some of the smaller ones, but there were a lot of custom things done. And for instance, like today, okay, some people who are very familiar with going to concerts at the Warfield, folks, that's a vaudeville and movie palace. I mean, there were movies on the opening night program. It was showing movies from the get-go and continued to show movies into the early 80s, mainly stopping in the late 70s, but there were a couple after that. But you go in there, and the Warfield, that plaster work in there, by and large, I would say probably 80 to 90% of it was created for the Warfield. There might be little things here and there, some of the cornices and things, but the armless satyrs and nymphs that are on the walls up by the balcony that are flirting with each other, seriously, they're looking at each other like this. They're up there. Those were made for the Warfield, and the big spandrels and proscenium only show up in that theater. And of course the Fox, that stuff was all custom. Even though the architects did do similar things in other theaters, you'll say, oh, that looks a lot like, and then you compare pictures up close and you're like, similar, but it's a different sculpture,
Yeah,
So,
it's amazing what the variety was in all of these theaters
oh yeah,
especially the 20s when they just kind of went wild with things.
oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm trying to think, just as an example, if there are. Well, I'll talk about the Reed brothers who did the Grand Lake, and they did do some very unique theaters like the Alexandria. They really, that was nothing done wrote there. But what's fun about their theaters is that while they did do some stuff that I feel was custom, they did reuse a lot of the same plaster molds throughout their theaters. And I learned this from being involved in particular with the Golden State Theater in Monterey, which is one of their best preserved. I mean, I'd say the Grand Lake is the best preserved. And then in their smaller theaters, the Sebastiani in Sonoma is very well preserved. That was their final theater they did after one of the Reed brothers actually died. But the Golden State in Monterey is really tops. I mean, I'm biased, I worked on it, but it's very well preserved. And because I got to know that plaster work in there, in some cases from painting it back to natural colors and stuff, and photo documenting, you go around to other theaters by Reed brothers and you see some of that same stuff. And so it's kind of fun to see that. And a lot of little twisted columns and false balconies that were put on the walls that would be backlit to look like windows and things like that. There's a theater in South San Francisco, the State, which I think closed in the 70s, early 70s or so. And it's a Reed Brothers theater. It had an artificial night sky on its ceiling. And you go on the outside of that one, and there are some cast concrete bits of detail that were done in plaster on the inside of the Golden State in Monterey. So they reused those molds for, could be plaster one place or concrete someplace else. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's the haven't I met you before syndrome, when you go around looking at these things.
I think the State Theater in Marysville uh,
Oh
was
yeah.
kind of along those same lines where it all looked pretty familiar for, uh, for a big movie theater.
Yeah.
But for the
Yeah.
most part, when I was growing up, I went to very plain theaters in Woodland at their State Theater. It
Yeah.
was very plain theater,
Pretty
built in
simple.
the 40s, I think.
Yeah, I was in that one before they did their restoration and remodeling that they've been either working on or have completed, which reminds me I need to check in on that and see see how that came along or how it is coming along. But
Mhm.
that theater actually was it was a team up by S. Charles Lee from L.A., the guy who did the remodel of the front of the Berkeley, and William David, who was more local. He did a lot of theaters in the Bay Area, and then up the coast, going up to Eureka, like the Eureka Theater and the Fortuna. He did those. Um, uh, if anybody knows, notoriously, the Palm Theater in San Mateo, which was the last theater in the Bay Area to run porn that had actually been built for legitimate regular movies.
Mhm.
That one, that was a William David, and he would oftentimes with some of his bigger projects he would involve himself with another architect,
Mhm.
and different ones they would do that sometime. Um,
The theater that I went to the most growing up was the Sutter Theater in Yuba City, and that's a very plain theater too. It's one level, kind of like in interior, just sloping floor going down to
yeah,
the screen, and not much looking at it from the outside either.
well, it was of its day. It's for instance, it's whatever stainless steel or aluminum, whatever it was, box office was probably a catalog order because it was the same as the box office as the Sarah in Daly City, which is gone, and the Rio in Santa Cruz, which that box office is still there. They had to repair it because of somebody crashed their car into it, but. Yeah, and so yeah, Yuba City, exactly. But like I say, it was of its period. After World War II, and my dad used to tell me this, and my dad was old enough to remember silent movies, and then he was in the Navy doing animation for them. And he said that there was a huge cultural shift, and I've heard this from other people that remember. After World War II, it's like we've been through the Depression, we've been through this war. Let's not have anything look like anything before. And you look at trade magazines of the late 40s, early 50s, and yeah, with the movie theaters, they still were doing murals, they were still doing terrazzo. There was a little bit of Art Deco creeping in with some of them, but by and large, they were moving toward what people are now calling mid-century modern for a lot of it. But there was overlap. You'll see the two styles mixed in the same building. But yeah, the Sutter in Yuba City, you and I both know Jack Tilmany, the theater historian who ran theaters. That was his first theater that he fully managed
Mhm.
on his own.
Maybe when I was going to it, for all I know.
Yeah, yeah.
Early 60s or mid 60s. I think that's,
He would have come back to the Bay Area by then,
yeah,
but late 50s, I'm sure.
yeah,
Um,
okay.
yeah, yeah,
I moved to Yuba City in 1959, so
yeah, yeah.
maybe, but his baby was the Gateway Theater in
Right,
San
which I
Francisco.
never got to go to. I was living in Aptos, going to the Sash Mill. If I had lived in San Francisco or someplace on the North Peninsula or even Oakland or whatever, I'd have been going there for sure. Because he tells
I,
stories about that. I go, oh, no.
yeah, I went to it many times. That I was at San Francisco State University in the early 70s, and that was the peak of the repertory theater period where you could go to a repertory theater every single night of the week and not repeat yourself. And they were showing, the whole product of the 30s of RKO and Warner Brothers and 20th Century Fox and all of these obscure films from those time periods.
That's where
And,
I got
uh,
my first
and
education in
Dad
film
was showing
noir.
a lot of that stuff at
Yeah.
his theater there.
Oh
So I was
yeah,
there a lot.
yeah. Lucky. Yeah. And then of course for, like you had, there were other things going on in the city too for other, I don't remember when the Roxy started doing its kind of offbeat programming, but there was that and others and Mike Thomas and Greg Kiehn were doing their stuff on Market Street, and the Strand was showing some vintage, but also cult classics and some more recent cult stuff and a little bit of foreign and whatever, and of course there's stories that come along with that from those guys, just
Mhm.
stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, the Surf Theater was active during that time period, and that's
right,
where I saw first the uh, Buster Keaton revival, and I think it was
yeah,
71 or 72, and the Surf showed all of those Keaton
yep.
features of the 20s, and a lot of the Arbuckle Keaton shorts, as well as the Keaton shorts before the features as
Interesting
well.
about that one because I never got to set foot in the Surf. I was living in Oakland when it was during its last years, and I would go over to San Francisco to the Castro to things and a few others, and I was just going to all these theaters I hadn't been to because I had been in Santa Cruz County and and so on, and so I was going all over the place. And when I could, of course, I did have homework to do, so I couldn't go as much. I was like, yes, I am paying X amount of dollars per semester to become a professional illustrator. And
I
I did
ignored all my homework
homework,
and
but
went
I
to the
got out
movies.
to a lot of theaters. But yeah, I see there are a few pictures of the interior of the Surf in its later days, and it was pretty plain. I know I would have gone in there and going, oh, this movie's great. It's like, gosh, what was in here? Because I was always analyzing these buildings. But when I got that collection of blueprints, that theater was part of the collection,
Uh,
and it always was pretty plain, but
yeah, pretty small
unusual.
and plain.
Yeah, very small. But in the lobby, on the walls, there's a tiny lobby.
Mhm.
There were it shows these little drawings, and usually on the blueprint, little peacocks on the lobby walls with their tails fanned out. And I just wonder, and that was when they did a little redecoration, actually, a minor redo. They changed the marquee or something. And I'm wondering if maybe that was because somebody was inspired by the cast plaster peacocks in the lobby of the Alhambra, which was a first class neighborhood house as far as decor and programming in its early days,
Mhm.
and pretty ornate for a neighborhood theater. And yeah, it has these peacocks at each end of the lobby with their tails fanned out, backlit with lights, pretty ornate. I'm just wondering if a decorator, was kind of going, yeah, these guys, these architects and decorators did copy each other quite a lot.
Mhm.
And it was fine. It was in the trade magazines, there'd be articles about the new latest, greatest theater.
If I recall correctly, the Alhambra was one of those atmospheric theaters, was it? Or
Alhambra was not, and we're
no?
lucky that because the interior was landmarked when it became a Crunch Fitness gym, really the only thing that was remodeled out of existence was the seating. The balcony has terraces in it with exercise cycles and treadmills and things, and downstairs. And they actually still have a movie screen in the original proscenium. It's over the top. The outside looks like a mosque. I mean, I've been to Cairo, I've been to Istanbul. Timothy Pfluger designed it right. It looks like a mosque. And you go into the inside, and it's uh, Islamic Hindu hybrid on acid. Just wild stuff. The interior is there, and the in that one the pipe organ, instead of having its sound come out of two arches on either side of the proscenium, as it was done most often, there are some theaters where the organ was up above and it spoke out of the ceiling, as they say. And its huge mandala-like ceiling was the organ grill, and it was beautifully lit, and that's all still there. Like the chandeliers, such as they are, they're very small fixtures, but they're these little metalwork chandeliers, and it's still beautifully lit, and so the interior is still there. I'm not sure what the policy is on people walking in and going, I just want to look at the theater. There are some gyms that are like that. The Warner Theater down in Huntington Park, beautiful Art Deco theater, closed because of COVID, but up to that, they allowed people to just walk right in. It was kind of like, be respectful of our members, they're exercising. But they know that they've got this incredible landmark and just over the top Art Deco. It's as ornate as the Pantages, but smaller.
Mhm.
But they let people in. Yeah, I can't speak for Crunch Fitness or the gym that's inside the Metro Theater on Union. They might say, sorry, you have to be a member. You can come into the lobby and fill out a membership form. I'm sure they would let you do that. But because both theaters, the Alhambra has the whole, the Metro has elements of it. It's got the sidewall murals done in the 40s, beautifully restored, and the arches on the side from the 20s that kind of framed the stage and the organ grills. They're more kind of Spanish, Islamic, Greco-Deco something. But another one to visit, and you can just walk in. And I drove by a couple months ago, and they've survived COVID. In fact, I'll say, please go there. Is the Harding on Divisadero, late 1920s. Again, Reed Brothers, the architects of the economy. And yes, you can see plasterwork in there that appears in their other theaters. It was a little bit more of a sort of a low-budget Gothic style theater, medieval Gothic. Became a church in the early 70s. I've got a couple of seats upstairs from it when the church took some of the seats out. But then the church decided to sell it to a developer. There was a big fight, if you will, to save it from being torn down. I advised on that. I wrote some things for the city to read about its significance and so forth. And that theater, basically, whatever was there of the interior has been saved, other than the seats. And it's been made into it's called the Emporium San Francisco, and it's got vintage video games, vintage air hockey. They do DJ dancing. I think they have some live groups that actually perform on stage because the stage is there, the old vaudeville stage. And you go in there, you can see the organ grills, the proscenium, beautiful ceiling. The ceiling had its original paint on it. They touched it up, cleaned it. Beautiful open work, kind of grill work. Interesting thing about that theater was that my friend in the architectural salvage business, he and I in 2002 were allowed to salvage light fixtures from there that had been put in the late 30s, Art Deco light fixtures. They kind of spruced up the interior a little bit, because they would always do that. They'd redo marquees, redo the light fixtures, recarpet, maybe change out the seats. But maybe if they were on a budget, they'd leave the medieval decor or the Egyptian decor or whatever up on the walls and ceiling, because that'd be a big investment. Mm-hmm. And so these deco fixtures were in there, and the church wanted to get rid of them because they wanted to put stuff in there that looked more churchy after having had the building since the 70s. And so we went in there and removed 15 light fixtures from there. And over time, this friend and colleague sold off most of the stuff. 2 chandeliers are now in the bar in the Lake Merritt Hotel, where they look like they've been in there forever because it's kind of a little bit deco in there, and it's a 1920s hotel, so they're perfect. Those were the 2 best fixtures that were in there. A bunch of other things, I'm not sure where most of them went, but my friend had hung on to 2 ceiling light fixtures from the lobby. And I said, hey, yeah, still got those, because something's going into the Harding. They saved it, and this new business is going in. Here's a chance for 2 fixtures to go in restored and be right where they were originally. They needed a lot of work. He did the electrical, he had taken care of the powder coating of the metal parts, and because I do etch glass, I did glass for it because there were only a few pieces left. And I came up with a design that was historically compatible. There'd been a fragment of the original, which was like, okay, it had a star and some kind of lotus-like curlicues on it, but that was 2002. I don't remember. So I invented something that would go with the style of fixture and the room. So those went back right where they had been, and they're the only vintage fixtures in that building. And then they did some nice modern fixtures, which are compatible. They look good, and so you can go in there. But the nice thing is you can walk in there. It's not like tickets, please. You go in there, and you have a drink or a little food, and you play some air hockey, play some old-time video games, go see something on stage or whatever. And but the history is also respected. It's both hip and history. So yeah, that's
Are there any atmospheric theaters left around?
There are a lot. And if you go across the country, there are lots. I would put them in the several dozens. I'd say the biggest one that survived would be I'm pretty sure. The Majestic in San Antonio. Downtown San Antonio downtown has 2 restored theaters plus a huge movie palace where they just saved the facade, very impressive facade. And then out from downtown a little bit, a 1940s theater that was really, really huge. But to get to atmospheric theaters, the Majestic is over the top. John Eberson, the architect in the Midwest, who perfected the atmospheric style and invented many of its special effects and motifs that it was known for. That is, if there's a must-see bucket list one, and I have not been inside, Majestic in San Antonio. One that's considerably smaller, because the Majestic is like the size of the Oakland Paramount or the Oakland Fox or whatever. But there's one in Tampa, Florida that's incredible. And that one's great because not only is it an atmospheric theater with these wonderful Spanish buildings on the walls, it's like a Spanish Pirates of the Caribbean, Spanish colonial thing. And all the stars work and the sunset and everything, has a Wurlitzer pipe organ, the whole bit. But in that theater, unlike many of the theaters that have been restored, most of the furniture that was in the lobbies, the floor lamps with their fringed shades. I remember this one sort of sideboard with a model Spanish galleon on it. I asked them, is that original? They said, well, it is, or very close to it. So it still feels like a movie palace. You've got the big overstuffed couches you can sit in while you're waiting for the show to start. So the Tampa in Tampa, Majestic in San Antonio. California has a milder climate, so they didn't build as many. But if you were to go for big ones in California, I would say definitely go to Santa Barbara, the Arlington Theater that was built by Fox, really the Fox Arlington. There's that one. It's got kind of a Mexican whitewashed and tiled village down the side walls. It's got a nice pipe organ too, brought in from another theater. Still runs movies, but also does performing arts, symphony, and plays and things. There are others scattered around. In LA, there were very, very few. The best preserved is the Alex in Glendale, which was done in ancient Greek style because it was originally named after Alexander the Great. It was the Alexander. Then later got a neon front, which is beautiful in its own right, late 30s, early 40s kind of thing. But you go in the auditorium and 90% of it is like, it's got columns like the Parthenon and everything. And my dad went there in the early 40s because he had just joined Disney, and that theater was one of the places where they would preview some of the cartoon shorts. And Dad, he didn't remember the name of the theater. He said there was this one theater, I think it was out, I don't know, Burbank, Glendale, something like that, and they would run a lot of the Disney stuff. So my friends and I would go there to see how the public would react to the shorts and how we had we done our job in making the people laugh. He said, but there was this one theater that the lights would dim so slowly before the show that it was like, he's like, wait a minute, is it getting darker in here? Like twilight, this is great, and he's looking at these walls, these temple walls and everything. So that one apparently had a very convincing effect. Whether or not it had stars on the ceiling, I don't know originally. But around the Bay Area, we had a few. So there was the Palace in East Oakland, had a full atmospheric with night sky on the ceiling, definitely. The Fairfax in Oakland was atmospheric with false windows on the sides and balconies, with sky down front and along the sides, but the ceiling was stenciled to look like a tent, just like the Golden State in Monterey, which you can go see shows there. The State in South San Francisco was full atmospheric. Its auditorium has been divided horizontally to be kind of retail down below and like a little rentable banquet hall and wedding facility now. But the sky is still there with some buildings. And then, interesting one, the Parkway in Oakland, not the new Parkway that's running movies. They're a great venue, built from scratch as far as converting a non-theater into a theater. And it's a neat place to go for atmosphere anyway. Not historic, but worth a look for creative use of the space. But the old Parkway, opposite side of Lake Merritt, it's hard to say it's outside. I'll just call it neoclassical. I hate to quite call it that. But you go inside and it's got ancient Egyptian, it's got winged sphinxes on either side. They are Egyptian. They have pharaoh heads. They're not winged Greek sphinxes. But they've got some vultures on the walls. There's a big sun disk over the proscenium with cobras and wings. and an interesting arch modeled loosely actually after Grauman's Metropolitan in LA, long gone, huge theater, but the arch is similar. And the ceiling was a sky at one time. Big vaulted smooth ceiling, it was a sky. So yeah, I'm getting a few more, but that was.
I know that the Shattuck theaters in Berkeley, they were built in the original Hinks department store,
Yeah.
put in I think one or two atmospheric
Yeah,
theaters in their group that
right.
people can get a little bit of a hint
You
of
get
what
a
it
little
was
feel
like.
from that. The stars are done with fiber optic cable. Um, I used to work for a company that did that, not stars, but we used fiber optics for edge lighting pieces of etched glass, so you can hide the lighting. We also use neon sometimes too. But I was thinking someday I want to do somebody's home theater and be able to do fiber optic stars. I have done a couple of home theaters by painted murals, no stars, but yeah. Where that started as far as neo-atmospherics was, I remember when they opened, was the two little theaters that were added next to the original auditorium of the Grand Lake. And the artisan that did those two theaters for the Grand Lake, and they opened those two little side ones opened in 1985, and I went, I was living in Oakland, so it was like, yay, one of them's Egyptian, the other one's is Islamic style. And yeah, the Islamic style has patterns on the ceiling. It's not atmospheric. It's they use Bradbury wallpaper actually, and it's effective. It's really cool. But then the Egyptian one, it has the little dimming lights with the fiber optic stars, and then the Shattuck used the same company that did the ornament inside and worked it out, even though it was run by somebody else other than Renaissance Rialto, who has the Grand Lake. And yeah, and I'm not actually sure. I've been to the Shattuck, I don't know, 10 times or something over the years. And yeah, I'm not, there are 4 themed theaters, 2 Egyptian and 2 Islamic style, minarets and all that. Moorish, as they used to call it back in the 20s. That, I believe there are 4 themed ones. And then there are additional screens, which are very simple. They have little skies on the ceiling, but no frills and just drapes on the walls. But hey, they have curtains. Yeah, so that was remember when the Shattuck opened, that was pretty cool that they were active reusing that old thing. Moving down Shattuck Avenue though, have you been into the old UA, the Art Deco?
Yeah, many times.
Yeah,
I wish I could have been in it when it was undivided, but never got there for that. But
yeah.
you can go in and see what it was like just by going from one theater to another there. It must have been tremendous when it was intact.
And it was part of a building program that United Artists did, without going into the intricacies, because I don't know all the intricacies, but they were having a competition with Fox West Coast theaters, and so they were getting into this building program of doing these theaters kind of by the same architects all along the same line, Art Deco, and a bunch of them down in Southern California, and they had a plan to expand and do some in the Bay Area. They buried the hatchet with Fox and worked out some deals about product and who would run what theaters and show what product. And so they truncated their building program. But if you look at the United Artists on Shattuck, one Shattuck, beautiful, huge sign, huge marquee. I mentioned that in my presentation when I showed a picture of it. And these bas-relief panels of a man and a woman, heroic figures symbolizing unity and artistry. And that was to have gone on all of, or nearly all of their theaters. Well, they built some of them in LA. There was one in Long Beach, one in Pasadena, that one's still standing, converted to retail. One in El Centro, which is still there, last I heard. There was one on Wilshire Boulevard, that one's torn down. And I know I'm missing one or two. But anyway, then the one in Berkeley is the only Northern California one that got built. If you know downtown San Jose and South First Street, where the big California Theater Movie Palace is, across the street and down is a theater called The Studio, built in 1950. The United Artists San Jose would have been built on that piece of property and the adjacent property immediately north. And it would have had the United Artists, Unity and Artistry thing. I actually found a copy of the San Jose Mercury. Not sure if it was Mercury News yet. Sorry, but they actually put a rendering in the paper, and they said groundbreaking will be this April, and it should be open by the following summer or something like that. Never broke ground. Didn't happen. But it would have been 2 stories high with storefronts and then offices up above, then that theater facade, and facing right onto South First Street. And there were going to be others. There was going to be one in Palo Alto. Can you imagine a theater of maybe 800 to 1,000 seats being built in Palo Alto, competing with the Stanford and the Varsity, plus the little early Menlo Park one in Menlo Park, and the Mayfield on California Avenue, and everything is like, oh my gosh, I found a list of all the theaters that was going to be part of that program, and I had heard someplace that there was going to be one up in San Rafael, but it wasn't on that list. So this history sometimes, what was going to be done, what wasn't done, sometimes can be a little hard to organize.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to be jumping in here. I've got a couple questions
Sure.
and a bit of information, and we are going to actually, you literally have like a minute to answer each of the 2 questions on the speed round, evidently. So Lisa does say her brother delivered silkscreen posters to the Fairfax and other Oakland theaters, and her father's company was the Process Poster Company. In 1927, one of her father's companies, Burke and Maxwell, leased the Casino Theater in Oakland's Fruitvale district. They put on plays. The building is now the True Buddha, and I don't know how to say this right, Vieja Temple. And she said that she loved the Gateway, and Jack Tilmany had a deal with MGM and got prints made off of the camera negatives. So very nice. So, okay, I got 2 questions. So Ted asks, any thoughts about rescuing and moving pipe organs? Apparently the Fox in San Francisco was demolished on an accelerated schedule, allowing very little time to move the pipe organ.
Well, the short answer is that pipe organ is intact, playing inside the El Capitan Theater, which is run by Disney, across the street from Grauman's Chinese on Hollywood Boulevard. You want to hear the Fox organ? Take in a show at the El Capitan. Beautiful 1920s theater. So,
okay. All right. Yeah. All right. We got one more question here from Michael Aus. Are there any of the old palace type theaters left that could still be restored, or are they all torn down?
No, there are many that are restored. I know I have little time. In the Bay Area, the most biggest and beautiful, Oakland Paramount, Oakland Fox, Warfield, Golden Gate, and Orpheum, Castro, Alhambra, and San Francisco. Big one in San Jose, the California. There are a ton. Many of them are now performing arts centers, doing opera, symphony, occasional movies. Out in the Central Valley, there's the Fox in Stockton, the Warner in Fresno. There are many of them, and they're all across the country. You just have to look for them. As far as ones that are still waiting to be restored, the biggest one in the country is in Chicago, the Uptown. It's a matter of getting the money together. They want to save it. It's colossal. It's as big as the San Francisco Fox. It's gigantic. I've been in it. And here's my cat. This is Jasper. So there are many are gone, but there are many still there. So.
I think Jasper is saying goodbye.
MGM Lion. He's trying to be the MGM Lion.
That's what it is. Okay. Well, we do have another Zoom coming up soon. It was really, really fun listening to both of you just going on about these different things. It's and this will live on. We will be posting it on our YouTube channel and on our website very soon. And I want to thank you all for the wonderful discussion.
Your local movie palace. I want you. Hey, thanks everybody. David, Rena, thank you very much. Thank you to the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum and the Edison Theater there for making this possible.
You bet. And the picture behind David is the LA Pantages.
Some of my dad's cartoons premiered also for Disney. That is the LA Pantages.
I got to see the Muppets live there, so who knew? Okay.
Thank you,
care, folks.